Okay, everyone, we seem to be getting towards a critical mass of participants logging on. So good morning. My name's Matt Regan. I am Senior Vice President of Public Policy at the Bay Area Council. And welcome everyone this morning to our weekly COVID-19 Impact webinar series. Today we are discussing how to reopen the economy. We've been going through, as you know, a long conversation about shutdown, and we've begun to pivot now in public discourse and political discourse towards reopening the economy. And today's conversation is about best practices, lessons learned, and how to do that, what to do, what not to do. And we have three great business leaders from the Bay Area joining us, and I'll introduce them one at a time in just a minute. But just to set the stage, as you know, in mid-March, 7 counties in the Bay Area issued shelter-in-place orders and essentially shut down the economy to combat COVID-19. 2 days later, on March 19th, the governor of California issued a similar, though less prescriptive, order for the whole state of California. Just last week, the governor issued another update that has described what the reopening will look like. It's a 4-phased approach. We are now in phase or stage 2, and some counties are beginning to reopen slowly, though they have to show that they've stabilized their caseloads, that they have sufficient testing capacity and sufficient hospital bed capacity should things take a bad turn. Nationally, only 6 states remain fully shut down, and California is one of them. We were one of the first to close and appeared to be one of the last to reopen. So obviously California is taking a very conservative approach. Within California, there's a little bit of a patchwork quilt of regulation and different standards that have applied. Some of the more rural counties, for example, that have lower infection rates are fully open for business, albeit with safety protocols. Modoc, Yuba, Sutter counties have opened all of their retail businesses. LA, on the other hand, Mayor Garcetti, as you probably know, announced this week that it looks like another 3 months of shelter in place will be in place there in LA. So we're going to have a great conversation this morning with 3 great business leaders, and I'm going to start with Keith Knopf. Keith is the CEO of Raleys Nob Hill Foods, one of our leading retailers, and I personally want to thank Keith and his staff, his frontline staff, for keeping us all well fed during this crisis. You've done sterling work. I'm a customer, and I'll be headed there shortly after this call to stock up. But Keith, you've been open throughout the pandemic, the shutdown, and your frontline workers have been heroically making sure, as I say, that we're fed. Can you maybe give us a little background on what that's been like and give us your perspective as a major retailer?
Sure. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, our business has maintained continuity amidst remarkable circumstance, of course. And there's a lot of things that we were able to scale up rapidly, and there were a lot of new things that we needed to think about better or differently. Safety of our customers, safety of our team has always been a priority, but amidst this crisis, incredibly even more so. So that has been a filter on everything we have done. Safety first and foremost, focused first with our team members, and believing that if we kept our team members safe, we would be serving the community and helping them stay safe. So we implemented a number of different processes around safety, certainly reacting quickly and in compliance with any of the county ordinances. And we have a complicated operating model in that we have 130 stores spread across 2 states and nearly 50 different counties. So in addition to dealing with federal, state, and county issues, a highly matrixed, very complicated operating model that became increasingly more complicated quickly. And we did rally the organization through a series of stepped up communication and focus. Daily huddles at the executive levels and all the critical individual contributors to make sure that we were empowering small teams to make fast decisions and then to implement them quickly, deliberately, and then to measure our compliance, whether it was compliance to our own expectations or that of a county or state ordinance. And I was really proud of the team for how quickly we adopted this new mode of working. And we did so while many of we call our corporate office support center, about 80% of them were asked to work remotely. The executive leadership team and other key contributors did come into the office and have been so over the last 100 days. And that cadence of communication with each other, that cadence of communication with the team member and with the public, I think has really made a big difference in our ability to help people become comfortable with how we were managing risk, how we were mitigating exposure, and how we were ever evolving as the needs and the science and the information became more apparent. We're a highly matrix operating company, and most of us just know us from the grocery store business, but we run pharmacies. We're a logistics company in that we are in the distribution business. We're in the trucking company business. We're in the refrigeration solar repair business. We manufacture fixtures and furniture for other companies such as Google and Apple. We're an investor in Silicon Valley and technology startup companies. We produce food, bottle and distribute for other brands in addition to what we sell, such as Coke and Tillamook on the West Coast. So a highly matrix model that had a lot of moving parts, but we prioritize safety, sanitation as the first and foremost thing that drove all of our behavior, all of our thinking and activity.
Thank you so much, Keith. And again, can't thank your employees enough for the work that they do and have been doing. I should have at the outset mentioned for the participants, if you go to the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A box. So that's where you can ask questions of the panelists. Type them in there and I will relay them to the panelists as we move along. And you should also know that you're all muted and none of your cameras are working. So if you're in your PJs this morning, nothing to worry about. You won't be seen. Just us on the panel. So I want to go next to Janet Lampkin. Janet's the market president for California and the West Coast for United Airlines. And Janet, this has been a particularly trying time for your industry. So if you could give some perspective on that. And also you're a member of Governor Newsom's the economy. So your perspective is very important in that regard as well. If you could share some of your if you're at liberty to share some of your perspective.
Certainly, yeah, it's great to be here. Thanks, Matt. Yes, so this has been obviously a very challenging time for our industry and company. It's the worst, really, crisis that the aviation industry has had in history. So it's been very challenging, and I'll just kind of walk you through the arc of what we have been doing during this entire time. Initially, as everyone, Americans and others, were trying to get home, we were working very closely with the federal government, State Department, and all of the U.S. embassies and embassies of other countries to ensure that everybody could get home. And so we were very involved in that effort initially. Of course, all of our employees continue to go to the airport as we are an essential service. We then started to pivot to cargo, which has always been a component of our business, but suddenly it ramped up, and fortunately we thought that through. That wasn't just a happenstance. We very strategically realized that we were in a perfect position to help bring PPE from China, particularly given all of the routes that we have to China, and other locations into the US. So we started ramping up that activity very, very quickly. And I am far more affluent in that, the logistics and forwarding and all those components than I ever have been. We are really proud of the fact that in the month of April, I think we flew 800 cargo flights, bringing critical supplies into the US and then distributing it within the US. So that has been a big component of what we've done. Our passenger business has dropped considerably. As you can imagine, demand is very low, and we've reduced our schedule by 90%, which is a stunning number. And it's been challenging for our employees, as you can imagine, who are accustomed to being at the airport, serving customers, being of assistance. So on that front, we have really set up several virtual volunteering activities for them, because they're dying to help customers, our community. And so one of the projects that we actually are working on, we're doing some work with the food bank in Silicon Valley. We're also working with the governor's office and checking in on seniors. So many of our customer service agents that are, again, typically dealing with customers and helping work through issues or serving them in one way or another, are now calling isolated seniors throughout the state to ensure that they're taken care of. So it's been a very gratifying way for our employees to use the great training that they have. And then in addition, we have, as Keith said, safety has been number one for our industry. And in fact, aviation has been, there's almost nobody better than aviation in safety. And so safety now has absolutely involved and encompassed cleaning and sanitation. And so we have completely revamped the protocols that we have, both for our employees to ensure that they have the safe workplace that they need with social distancing and other things, but that the aircraft itself has a whole new standard of cleaning. And one of the things that we're doing is using electroplastic sprayers, which are used in hospitals, and we spray down every surface within the airplane every night. And starting next month, it will be after each flight. So we're doing other measures. We're asking our customers to wear masks. Our employees are wearing masks. We're distributing sanitizer towelettes to every passenger. We're continuing to evolve that process. We're continuing to ramp up that process. And that will be true, I believe, for anyone who is serving the public. I think we're going to start to see the retail industry come back, restaurants with some accommodations coming back. Those components of sanitation and cleanliness seem to really be the criteria and the protocol now for every industry. And that, frankly, has been part of the discussion at the governor's task force. Some of you may know he has organized the task force into kind of 3 segments, which is immediately going back to work, then once we're back to work, what's necessary, and then in the longer term, what about industries like airlines, like amusement parks, that really are probably going to see a longer return to get back to their pre-COVID levels. And then in addition, there is a whole group of work being done around, is this an opportunity for innovation? Can we do things better, differently? What's the impact on the environment? Is there, just with an eye towards ensuring that we protect the environment? And then also that the return is actually one that has a strong focus on equity and ensuring that we, as we recover, all segments recover in an improved way and all stakeholders do. So that work is very broad and very interesting and very thoughtful about getting the input of all of the different participants on what the impact will be and how they view the challenges of it.
Thank you, Janet. You're in an unenviable position. I think all of us will agree. It's certainly for your industry. This is probably the, as you said at the outset, the biggest challenge of our collective lifetimes. I, for one, cannot wait to get back on a plane. Next up is Chris Raleys. Chris is the CEO of Plant Construction, one of our largest building companies in the Bay Area. And as you probably know, when the Bay Area shut down independently ahead of the state, their more prescriptive shutdown standards included construction, residential as well as commercial and office. And that created some problems, but we were able to get the construction industry at the front of the queue for the reopen as the Bay Area started to lift its shelter-in-place order. And that came with some pretty strict standards. Chris, why don't you give us a little bit of an idea of what it's like in the construction industry and how you have begun to reopen your business and get your folks back to work?
Sure, and thank you for having me as a panelist today. So prior to COVID, we were on our way to a record year by about 30%. We were typically doing, between $300 and $400 million, and we were looking at doing about $500 million this year. So we were really moving well. The last 2 months, quite honestly, have felt, and I'm sure for everybody else that's on the call right now, the last 2 months to me have felt like at least 2 years. The amount of work that we've had to put in just to, respond, to be nimble, fast, and then the communication, over communication, you can never communicate enough. So one of the things that we did right away was set up daily calls like Keith with our all department heads, and we continue that to this day. They take about a half an hour, and then we do a weekly call with the entire company with myself, the head of safety, our head of risk, our chief operating officer, and our head of field operations. And each of us speak for about 5 minutes. And we do that in groups of 30 and less. So we have about 300 people. So we do 10 of these meetings every week. So I've been on well over 200 Zoom calls in the last 2 months, and this is a welcome one. This is refreshing. I think it's very positive to see things coming back alive a little bit. For us, very similar to Keith and Janet's business, it's all about safety and compliance. One of the things that happened with us, the construction industry, was there was some very bad press. There was a project that got its way into the Chronicle with a picture of several dozen people piled up, and it was a very poorly run project, but it became the kind of the face of the industry. And most of the industry doesn't operate that way. So I think that was unfortunate. But for us, what I really recognize now is being nimble, and safety and compliance is really key. We work in all of the Bay Area counties, so we have projects that are falling under each county's direct compliance, as well as the state and federal, and the way that the recent release back to work for us, the construction industry, is we have to meet the highest standard, meet or exceed the highest standard. So we have safety compliance officers that are on every project now that are basically like coronavirus police, making sure that all the processes for cleaning and sanitizing are documented, and that people are all being screened properly, and that we keep a record of it before they come on the job. So there's been a whole bunch of things that are going to be around for a very long time that are affecting our industry. And I'm hearing from some contractors that their profitability is severely hampered because of the social distancing. It depends on the type of work for us. We do a lot of confined space sort of things where we put people in very close quarters, whether it be in long trenches, installing pipe, or in shafts, where we do steel reinforcement, and we have people, carrying heavy steel reinforcing bars for concrete operations. So we've had to study each of these operations individually, and break those down, and then write plans for all of the activities before we actually do the work. So the amount of preparation that's going into all of the work is equal to the work itself. So our industry has completely changed. The ones that have gone into this, we're in a recession, let's face it. The ones that have had momentum going into the recession are going to do really well. Some, just like restaurants, where if they're carrying debt, or they have lots of lawsuits and debt, there's probably going to be some that don't make it through in the long run. So this has been a very scary time. For us, we caught it at the right time, having a record year for revenue. But the concern really now is 2021. What does the economy do? What does it look like? And until then, we're going to continue to have all of the field people. They have to be in the field. So just like a grocery store, we can't, we can't remote op, from the, we can't operate remotely in the field. We have to execute that work. But on the office side, we have about 130 people. All but about 3 of those people are working from home, and I have no plans to bring any of those people back for a long time because the business is functioning. But the other 160, 170 people that are in the field, they have to be there. Just today we're pouring 300 yards of concrete at the Presidio, where we're doing all of the parks that are going to connect the 101 and Christie Field to the Presidio. So we're operating, we're 100%, our employment is back at 100%. But for us, the real concern, like everybody else in this call, is, what happens in 2021? Because we have work for 2020, but that starts to get burnt off. We need new sales. Typically, we win a new project about every 2 weeks, and we've only won one in the last 8 weeks.
Thank you, Chris. Fascinating perspective, given the fact that, as I say, your folks are out there on the street and working, swinging hammers as we speak. I want to maybe open this up, and each of you can chime in any specific order. We're talking right now about sort of the next phase, the next few weeks, the next maybe few months of reopening the economy. But I think we all can agree that this experience has probably profoundly changed the work experience, probably for our lifetimes. I think we've been introduced to remote working. We've been introduced to technologies like this, and the ability to work from home. Do you see, obviously, we chose the 3 of you, obviously, for your great talents as speakers and entertainers, but you also represent industries that require people to be at work. I mean, remote working is not feasible for a large number of your employees. We're not ready for remote, piloted airplanes yet. I don't think, Janet, but you also have staff, back office staff, support staff that possibly can work remotely. Do you see, as we move forward, post-COVID, 6, 8, 9 months, a year, that you will have more people working remotely, more people working from home than ever before?
I'll start, Ian. Yeah, obviously, as you said, Matt, we cannot. Our work is at the airport for the most part, and while there are some, back office management or business jobs and roles, my view for us is that post-COVID, we're all going to want to be there together. Everyone's going to want to have that interaction, that collaboration, that just popping in another person's office and having an idea, that you can bounce off them. I think there definitely will be, and we talk to our customers all the time. We're in very close connection with them right now. And I do think for some industries, this will be the new norm, more of this type of interaction. However, we really see a pent-up desire for people to physically connect again. Everyone is really anxious to do that. So I think there will be, for some industries, definitely it will change things, but for many people, they still really value that collaboration and integration you get being in person.
Keith, any perspective?
Thank you, Matt. I'm in the mindset that Janet touched on, that the requirements for sanitation is an ongoing thing, and businesses or brands that establish, an expectation with the customer that they are going to be more vigilant, ongoing, and I believe at least for the next year. I think that those businesses will be appreciated and rewarded for that by the customer, given that commitment level. For that reason, our commitment to safety, sanitation, and other provisions we put in place, I believe, will remain in effect for at least a year. I'm also operating under the presumption that this crisis will continue in some form or resurge later, in the winter months ahead. So, our preparations today, many of which will need to stay in place, and I think all for good reasons. How that affects the workplace, we have 13,000 people. About 1,000 of them are in support functions or in office environments like the one I'm sitting in. 80% of them have been working remotely. Our continuity has continued to be productive and efficient. We've had to leapfrog some of our proficiencies around technologies, which we've kind of figured out quickly. I don't think there will be a return to work in this building or others like it soon. As Chris mentioned, we're functioning. The stores are a different scenario, right? Those are frontline. You can't do that work remotely, so that will continue. I think what will change more from my perspective, and at least here for Raleys, is governance around decision-making and how we think about the year to come. I'm completely on track with what Chris said around, what's next. And we're kind of referring to that as the next normal. And I think for us, and to the degree it's interesting for the audience, I think there's a need to act with deliberate but greater urgency. We've long been a business that's been steeped in analysis, and quite candidly, the history is blown up, and it is not predictive of the future now. So more emphasis on testing, less on analysis, for example. I'm operating with the premise that every economic model is wrong. Some are useful, but you got to synthesize a lot of points of view and then chart a course that you believe makes sense for your sector and specifically for your business. And Chris mentioned this agility. Even the way we think about budgets, and we used to think about budgets kind of in an annual context, but without the ability to really have a good understanding of where this economy is going and how it spills into our business, we've gone to more of a free-flowing forecasted model, so that we're not locked into a certain set of assumptions when reality is, we can't know exactly what's going to happen and when. So this notion of agility and even how we think about our budgeting, our expense, and our capital planning, we've had to rethink. So I think it's more for us, those kinds of things that are more germane to the next norm than whether or not people work from home or in the office.
Thanks, Keith. Yeah, I think your comments about following economic models are I think we're all in sort of the gut mode right now. What does your gut tell you? And I know that I do like to occasionally make fun of the economists at the Bay Area Council Economic Institute. They've successfully predicted 8 of the last 4 recessions. So I do share your skepticism sometimes. But I'm going to go to Chris next and maybe get your perspective on, obviously, what does the construction industry look like a year from now? Can you maintain the current safety protocols that have been imposed upon you? Is it going to be a viable business in a year from now?
Well, that's a really good question. Boy, I had a whole bunch of things I was prepared to say until you twisted that thing at the end. Is this sustainable in the future? And, I really don't know. The question is whether or not it's going to be required in a year. Because if you think about, what we're doing right now, what we're doing in the grocery stores, wearing masks, having things sanitized before you touch them, after everybody touches them, public restrooms, who's going to use a public restroom, transportation, transportation in general is down, more than 90%. So I think the industry will respond to whatever is required to happen, so that's going to be there. To me, it's really about confidence is a very big reality factor here that the economists can't predict. I take a lot of I talk to Mike Rubius as much as I can to get some insight. How's the real estate market going to respond? And Mike's opinion is that He told me, look, whenever I've made a life out of when everybody goes left, I go right. And he thinks he's predicting that people have short memories. This is, eventually people will be back. I can tell you, the World Trade Center, I'm from, New York, and the company that I work for rebuilt the World Trade Center. I actually moved the first 3 tenants in 2006, 6 through 8. And, nobody wanted to go there. And it took, a lot of time to get people conditioned where their guard was down. Nobody wanted to go down to, in a subway. Nobody wanted to go into a high rise, let alone a high rise at the World Trade Center, where it was a #1 target in the world. So there was a lot of, angst and, real pain, fear of people wanting to go down there. And one of the things that the New York Academy of Sciences did, the CFO was very smart. He brought people down in groups, small groups of, 3 and 5, and repeatedly brought them down to get them familiar with the train route, with, the local stores. So there's a familiarity of, it's kind of warming up to home. And, what's scary about that is that it took 5, 6, 8 years before things returned to normal. And now, pre-COVID, the World Trade Center was, one World Trade Center was almost fully booked, fit out. 7 was fully occupied for years. 3 and 4 were getting fully occupied. So people will come back, but it takes a long time. And I think this is all going to come back. I just hope that we don't have to wait 5, 8, 10 years. But I do think it's going to come back.
Right. I'm going to jump to one participant question right now, because as the chair of the Bay Area Council, she gets special privileges. But Mary Huss asked, Google has recently announced that they're pulling out of the Pier 70 deal and not their option on that property. Do you think that's going to have a ripple effect? Is that a sign of things to come?
Well, a good friend of mine is one of the real estate people for Google nationally, and he's involved in the Pier 70 project. They could have worked from home for many years. And what, Brookfield and Google, in their negotiations, the conversation came up, in the last 2 months of, what are you guys doing? Are you going to stay in the deal or what? And I think this is just a pause. What Google will tell you is that they tried working remotely and they lost all their culture. And that is critical to their organization, which is why they started building these campuses of locking people in where there's no reason to leave. So they went, completely the opposite direction. I think that's a reality, is that people working from home is going to be a total loss of culture. And I think Google's going to come back. I think again, is it going to be 1 year? Is it going to be 3 years, 5 years? But their plans to build 8 million square feet down in San Jose, Silicon Valley area, that's going to be, brought down or paused, delayed. So that's the uncertainty. But I think they're going to come back. Whether or not they come back to Pier 70, I don't know. But culturally, I think Google recognizes that they have to have people working together. Just like Janet is saying, people want to be together. It's just, human instinct, basic need.
So now I'm going to ask sort of the big sort of elephant in the room question. And history will write the story of COVID-19 and our response to it. And as I mentioned in my opening comments, California was the first state to close, and it looks like we're going to be one of the last to reopen. And there's great public debate, and it's a political football as to, are we being too conservative, not conservative enough? Should we, be taking the LA approach and extending the shutdown, or should we be more aggressive? And obviously, there's been a very public spat between a high-profile Bay Area CEO, Elon Musk, and his county over reopening his factory. So individuals, Chris, you've got the microphone right now. What's your perception? Do you think too slow, too fast, just right?
Unmute myself. Okay. So,
Yeah.
look, I think I can tell you we have about 25 projects going with at least 1,000 workers, coming in and out every day. And we've been doing that for the past 8 weeks. We were one of the few. We really recession-proofed our business, so we do a lot of infrastructure, a lot of UC. What was interesting about the UCs, as a side note, is UC Berkeley determined themselves a public entity and exempt from the shutdown. So all of the Berkeley work kept going. UCSF didn't do that. And they determined, so they were one of the last ones to open up. They only opened up maybe 2 weeks ago. But we work for both. And we had a lot of continuity. We had 1,000 people a day for the last, maybe 500 in March 17th, 18th, but now it's back up to 1,000. We just had our first confirmation of a worker on one of our job sites with coronavirus yesterday. And that person was last on one of our jobs 12 days ago, so 13 days ago today. So I think a lot of it is being prepared, doing the right thing, really, emphasizing that everybody's acting and behaving, accordingly. And I think we can control this much, much better than the governor might think. And to me, just think about those numbers, to be working for 8 weeks, 1,000 people a day. Just our first one person, we had one scare where somebody's wife had it, and they never, we isolated that person, quarantined. They never came back to work for the 14-day period. But one in 8 weeks with 1,000 people, 20 to 25 job sites, either we're really doing something right, or we're lucky, a little bit of both. But I think we could have opened up. I think we should have opened up personally, at the first shelter-in-place shutdown. Was it April 4th or whatever the day was?
Janet, you have perhaps the most expansive perspective. United Airlines operates in every corner of the world, certainly every state. And California, are we an outlier? Are we too strict? Are we just right? What's your perspective?
Well, it's when you look at the world and internationally, we are not an outlier. There've been, I've talked a lot with our head of cargo, who's based in Europe, in Spain, and they were in very drastic measures long before we were. So I think the challenge is the consideration of all the right factors in place that the governor's put in place and other governors have put in place. The governor of Tennessee's put together a great set of protocols that has asked businesses to take on certain responsibilities, certain measures. Individuals have responsibility. And so I think when those protocols are in place, at some point we do have to get back out. And I think just stressing that requirement in those protocols is important. And I actually do think we will start to ease more quickly now, because I do think we're seeing other areas that have been able to somewhat successfully. But I have to say, I admire the rest of California and all of our Californians who really have adhered to this compared to our counterparts and our friends in other parts of the country. We really did take this very seriously, social distanced effectively. And I think that as it eases, that will continue. But the one more thing I will say, Matt, this patchwork though is very challenging for any business, everybody on the call, and all participants. And I understand that each jurisdiction has its own requirements and situation to consider, and that's all appropriate. But coordination at the government level between local, state, and federal will be critical so that businesses have some clarity about and some certainty about when each of them, and some coordination about when each will open.
Yeah, good point. I want to go to some questions now from our participants.
Matt,
sorry, Keith.
No worries. I'll be brief. It might be interesting, Raleys has, as the grocery industry has been completely wide open, right? Business not as usual, but business ongoing. And if you take Raleys as a microcosm, we've had 17,000 people work for us over the last 11 weeks, if you want to call that the COVID crisis period. And we've interacted with 2 to 2.5 million customers, unique individuals at least, assuming a transaction is one person, not a family of 2 or 3. And if you take that math and you just exponentialize that, tens of millions of interactions of people in an environment that has been engineered to be more safe than it's ever been. And while I wish the number were 0, out of the 17,000 people who have worked for us and the tens of millions of customers those people have come in contact with, we've had 3 confirmed diagnosed cases of COVID, all 3 of whom have recovered. And if you look at that as an affliction rate, and I'm just using this as a microcosm, I'm not suggesting we extrapolate it, but that's an affliction rate of 17,000, 3 against 17,000, of 0.017%, far less than 0.1%. And I use this as potential evidence that, to Janet's point, I think business can act responsibly and take the right necessary steps. I think the community at large will take, the necessary precautions to protect each other. And I do think that sets a path for opening up this economy in a deliberate but faster manner than perhaps has been prescribed.
That's very encouraging. Thank you for that, Keith. I think credit to you and your team for those staggering numbers. That's I think a statistic that should give us all hope. I want to, Chris, you mentioned this earlier in one of your comments, but I'll throw it open to all of you. And there's obviously a concern of a second wave in the fall, and there's again competing scientific and political opinions on whether that's going to happen. I think Keith, you said you already have contingency plans for that eventuality. What about Janet, Chris? Do you see that as something that's a feasible possibility and something you're preparing for?
Well, I will tell you, I'll start. We have planned for every possible scenario. And we did so, frankly, early on in February when this really first started to emerge and nobody understood the breadth or the severity of it. But we immediately got to work planning for every possible outcome. And the more we have learned, factoring that information into our outcomes. And so we have been planning for it, as I think most companies have, frankly. I think, again, to what Keith said, and I was saying, business and industry is very thoughtful about these kind of issues. We are agile, and we're all learning to be more agile, and putting plans in place is really kind of what we do, and understanding the various scenarios so that there's no surprises. Our incoming CEO often says, hope is not a strategy. You've got to have every single scenario mapped out and what your action items are. So if there are, from our perspective, we're prepared. And that, in my view, should be, an inhibitor to opening. I just think it's part of the journey that we're all on.
Thank you, Janet. That question came from Cassandra Pai, by the way, one of our members at Lucas Public Affairs. I want to, there's a number of questions from a number of participants about testing and, will employees be tested at the workplace every day? I know we're getting reports from our offices in China that's sort of pretty much standard operating procedure for buildings in China as they're going back to work. Let me go to Keith first. Do you see that as, are you doing that already? Are you testing your employees? Do you see that as something that's in your future?
We're doing health checks, which is different from testing, of course, symptoms and temp checking every day, multiple times for that matter, in store and in the office. but we have no current plans to implement testing as you're describing it.
I want to, I've got another question here from our former chairman, Alex Marin. And this is, about potential liability. Obviously, we saw the governor's executive order last week on workers, or was it earlier this week, on workers' compensation, that, the presumption rebuttal is now on the employer. If an employee files a workers' comp claim for COVID-related illnesses, the burden of proof is on you to say that they did not contact that at work. That's one major liability. There are other legal liabilities obviously in play that we need to be cognizant of. So I'll start with you, Janet. Is legal liability, workers' comp liability, a big concern for you?
I think it is always a concern for every business. Going into this, we, as essential workers, we have always been prepared to take care of our employees. I think the challenge with this one specifically, as Alan Zarenberg at the California Chambers pointed out, is that there is federal funding available to the state to access so that employees in this essential business category could access. So I think that's part of the challenge of it. I think the other challenge is business is cannot be in the position of having an undue burden of this recovery. We're all in this together, and so I think that is the other concern that the business community has, is the business community can't be expected to cover all of this recovery. Obviously doing fair share and the responsible thing and the right thing to do. But I think that's the component of the executive order that's been challenging, is that there was funding available at the federal level for it particularly.
Chris, I'll go to you next with that same question. Liability in a construction industry is one that's probably in the front line of conversations around safety, and it's in your DNA. It's a core part of your culture. But obviously, with these new rules and regulations, you're shaking your head.
This is terrible. This is one of the worst things that I've heard, in this entire 8-week period. And thankfully for us, there's a group called the Association of General Contractors. It's a national organization that has, 500, 600 members. Every big contractor in the country is a member of it, and luckily they have a voice with the government to try to stop this and reverse it, because it's extremely, to Janet's point, this is not just liability and risk, it's punitive. For us, we in order to keep our workers' compensation costs down, we put ourselves at risk for the first $100,000 per incident. So the entire workers' comp, all the carriers, which we use Alliant, who's one of the largest in providers in the country for our business. The rates are going to they're going to react, and those costs are going to be built into the entire cost of construction. So this is really, really counterproductive to getting the economy back. I think this is something that could really, really impact all construction across the nation. The union wages, there's a big part of it that's workers' comp related also. And I'm sure all of the unions are going to increase their workers' comp rates in the next rate negotiation. So it's punitive. There's really no way to protect yourself or to disprove, and the liability being on the contractor to prove, it's almost impossible. So it's a very, very scary concept. There is an Engineering News Record article that just came out yesterday about this, how fresh this is, and that the AGC, thankfully, there is an association such as the AGC to respond, because as an independent contractor, I'm defenseless. So we'll see how that plays out.
So Keith, you're one of the few places we're currently allowed to go, and when contract tracing is done, you know, the grocery stores on everybody's list, are you concerned about potential liability? I mean, you're obviously exposed as a place where people, you know, could potentially point to, that's where I got it, and I'm suing Raleys because, you know, is that a concern?
Is it a concern? Sure. You know, is liability of any kind always a concern, particularly when it comes to the health of team members or people? Absolutely. But, you know, I've chosen to focus less on the liability exposure, and I'll deal with that as it comes. And in good conscience, we got out of front of this early. We, in almost every step of the way, preempted or exceeded what was expected. We self-initiated. We have been very close to our team members, you know, not incentivizing them to work. We've rewarded them for their work, but we've not incentivized them to work more than they would normally or choose to do. We've been generous. We already had a generous leave policy, whether it was sick or personal time off. We stepped that up very early so that folks who had concerns, whether they were worried about just anxious about working in the environment or concerned about becoming sick, that they could stay home for a period of time on our dime. And that exceeded, then even preceded what the state might afford to them. So, you know, my tact has been to be guided by being generous, by being preemptive, communicating, encouraging our team members if they had concerns, fear for their safety or health risk, to stay home, and we would work with them in terms of leave and make sure that economically they could afford to do that for a fair and reasonable amount of time. And then to deal with the one-off circumstances even more so. And there are some unique situations that arise in every normal business, much less in this sense. So yeah, there's a concern, right? What it might mean financially, but you know, in good faith and good conscience, we've done everything that we could conceive of and more than what's been asked of us. And, you know, I trust in, you know, the good faith of our team members. And if there's an exception or an issue brought forward by a team member or customer, we'll manage that to the best of our ability.
Thank you. We've got 5 minutes left, and I'll take the last question. It's from Brendan Dunnigan at HKS. It's directed at you, Chris, but it's sort of relevant to all of you. So take a couple of minutes each to answer this, and it's really related to, you know, Brendan's asking about construction schedules and safety protocols, sort of throwing sand in the gears and gumming up the works and slowing things down. But obviously, with social distancing and safety protocols in place, how is that affecting workplace efficiency? What is it going to do long term if this is something we're going to be in for the long haul? What's it going to do to the efficiency of your workforce and at the end of the day, your profitability?
That's a great question. You know, I do think that our industry is very, we've already been very quick to adapt industry best practices for safety, you know, prior to coronavirus. So I think the industry is embracing it. What I'm really finding right now is some of the unions, quite honestly, need to get on board with what the general contractors are doing, what we're being required to do, such as screening before a worker comes onto the job site, where there are a few unions that, and there's the big concern with screening, which is similar, goes back to the question about what do we do in a test. It's a QAR system code that you can go through and do it on your phone before you come to the job site. We're required now to screen people if they leave the job site and come back. So this is a really big thing. There's a very big concern over you know, privacy, and people want to know what we're doing with the information. We don't want the information, you know, so we're going to align ourselves with the unions to get rid of those concerns. But as far as the schedules, our schedules have to be met, and we're actually we deal with about 1 or 2 subcontractor claims on a daily basis for inefficiency, delays, loss of productivity, and we're fighting for the owner on that issue because, if it's done properly, we believe that it can be done. I think there's going to be very, very few exceptions where this is a true added cost. Prior to this, there was so much inefficiency in the national market, especially the local market, for cost. We were in the busiest market since World War II. The union halls were empty. Everybody had more work than they needed. It would take you 3 hours to drive what you can do now in an hour. Prices are coming down. So I'm optimistic that the cost of construction is going to be, either flat or even decrease as a result of the economy and the coronavirus, the social distancing and all those things is just going to be built into how we operate.
Right. Thanks. And Janet, schedules are very important in your industry as well. We have 2 minutes left. Can you maybe give us a little of your perspective on sort of how safety protocols might impact the airline industry?
Yes, absolutely. Before this happened, we were driving efficiency through the company in a very effective way. And one of the things I think this has shown all of us is how incredibly resilient our teams are and how they can pivot quickly. So our view on our business is that demand is obviously down now, but it will spike at some point. No one knows exactly when, but it will spike, and people will want to go as other countries lift it. And so for us, it's that ability to pivot very quickly and be ready and nimble for that, keeping the efficiencies that we've learned over time. So efficiency actually for us has not been an issue, and this will only drive it further.
Keith, you've got 60 seconds.
I don't think I have much to add. I am optimistic that the state and the country will rebound. It might, have a year or two tail, but I think the fundamentals of our economy are and were strong. I think this is a different kind of recession. I think it will be shorter lived, and I remain optimistic that while things may not be as they were, the new normal will be a place of opportunity for employment and for people to try and do different things. And I think that on the other side of this, we're going to be stronger as a state and as a country, certainly as a company.
That is a fantastic note to end on. I want to thank all 3 of you for participating and sharing your experiences. I hope our participants have learned something about what the immediate future holds for their companies in terms of reopening the economy. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Janet. Thank you, Keith. This has been recorded. It will be on our YouTube feed before the end of the day if you'd like to rewatch it. And look forward to seeing you all next Thursday for the next installation of the Bay Area Council's COVID-19 webinar series. Thank you all for joining.
Thank you. Stay well.